I want to share with you the results of some work I've been doing looking at hubris in the banking and finance sectors, which has implications far beyond that, of course. The gentleman, not the telephone, the gentleman at the telephone we probably all recognise as the former Sir Fred Goodwin, at one stage no doubt one of the most hated men in Britain. And the other individual is not associated with banking, Harvey Weinstein, but he is associated with the negative effects of powerful people behaving in inappropriate ways, driven to do so by the confidence in themselves that they acquire as a result of having power. And I, as my accent betrays, grew up in Northern Ireland, which was a masterclass in watching dysfunctional leadership in many ways. Politics in Northern Ireland is like politics everywhere, except it is infinitely worse. We specialise in training our leaders to behave badly, and then we reward them by putting them into government on the basis that we would rather have them governing us than shooting us, which is not a model that I would recommend everywhere else. Well, I would also maybe advertise a bit and say that if we're looking at the dark side of leadership, among the excellent things that you can do is read this particular book, which among other things looks at how simply having power has on most of us a more negative than a positive effect. We know, for example, that when people get a little bit of power, they're more inclined to condemn cheating, but only in other people. They're also more inclined to endorse it when they themselves engage in it. When people are given a little bit of power, they're less likely to seek advice from other people, even though you could argue that that is precisely the point where they need it more. They are also less inclined to consider evidence when they are making major decisions. Again, when you might suggest that they need to do so more than ever. In other words, having power in itself seems to generate an excess of self-confidence, of self-belief. The corollary to that, a belief that other people have maybe less wisdom and less to contribute to the decision-making process than they actually do. My study has been in the banking sector, funded by the Daedalus Trust, and the banking sector has had a very bad press in the last number of years, as, to be honest, has corporate leadership in general. That well-known Marxist magazine, The Economist, had a cover a couple of years ago called Banksters, immediately after the Libor scandal, drawing attention to the dysfunctional leadership behaviours and the greed and avarice that was common within that sector. What I managed to do was to track down and interview around about 27 people, including 3 former CEOs, one of a bank, two of financial institutions other than banks, several senior managers and others, to really talk to them about what their experience of hubris was, and in particular what type of behaviours did people display that amounted to what we describe as hubris. And I'll share with you some of the stories and experiences that they shared with me and try to draw out from that some general lessons, both about how we can recognise the development, the beginnings of hubris in other people, and perhaps what also we can do to prevent its emergence. So what is hubris? We could, of course, talk about this all day, and our early notions of this go right back to classical Greek mythology, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go that far back, and simply say that most of us today think about hubris in these kinds of terms here in front of us. Overconfidence, taking in positive information in uncritical fashion, and so on and so forth. In other words, when people agree with us, when they offer us evidence that seems to support the conclusions that we have already half formed, we typically speaking don't interrogate that information very much. We accept it at face value, and I'm sure that if Jack Straw was here, he might agree that there was some elements of that around the time of the decision to invade Iraq, where dodgy dossiers or whatever were accepted much more uncritically than retrospective decisions would suggest. Hubristic individuals end up in a way like this. We might see relatively ordinary looking phenomenon, they see something else. And I think that the world of business is full of people in a way like David Brent. That is, people, boring men, fat men in suits, who think they are charismatic visionaries, but everybody else just sees a boring person in some kind of a business suit. Unfortunately, it's not just a question of individuals developing these traits that we might find disagreeable, but when people in positions of authority do acquire hubris, it does have very serious immediate organisational effects. We know, for example, that people in the banking and finance area exaggerate the advisability of acquisitions. They tend to overpay for them. They have grotesquely overambitious visions. To give one example of this, you might remember Enron, which went bankrupt in 2001. And up until Lehman Brothers went bankrupt a few years later, it was up to that stage the biggest bankruptcy in US corporate history. One of its two top people is still in prison. The other managed to avoid prison by dying before he could be sentenced. But before they went bankrupt, just a few months before that, they had a big banner outside their headquarters, the world's leading energy company. And then they announced that they had a new vision beyond that to become the world's leading company, not just in the energy sector, but full stop, the world's leading company. A hopelessly over-ambitious vision by any standards. And if we go back to banking, the Royal Bank of Scotland, which has been still to date the biggest bankruptcy in UK corporate history, 24 billion euros was spent acquiring ABN AMRO in the months leading up to the final breakdown of that particular bank. That is an example of the exaggerated advisability of acquisitions in action. So confident were Fred Goodwin and his colleagues that this made sense, that they did not even do proper due diligence. They did what they described as due diligence light. In other words, they barely looked at what it is that they were buying, a little bit like you or me deciding to buy a house on the basis of looking at a photograph in an estate agent's magazine, or deciding that we've identified our future wife or husband on the basis of an internet dating profile. This is more or less what happened in that particular case. So in terms of what we know about banking, there is, even apart from the work that I have done, abundant evidence that what we might describe as hubristic behaviours are widespread. This culture that greed is good, that goes back to Wall Street was that in the 1980s? When Gordon Gekko became famous. And some of you will recognise the individual in the top right, Bob Diamond, former CEO of Barclays Bank as well. So the people that I talked to gave me multiple examples of these dynamics in action. One woman that I interviewed, for example, described her CEO, who was also a female, who had a lift organised in the building in such a manner that she could key it when she went into it so that it would not stop at the floors going down to the basement. She did not therefore have to interact with the other drones who were there in the workplace. On one occasion, she forgot to activate the key. Somebody stepped into the lift and they were immediately asked by this woman to leave. She couldn't bear the thought of interacting with them in that way. My interviewee also told me that she met this woman at the checkout counter at Marks and Spencer's and simply passed the time of day with her on one occasion. The following day, her line manager brought her into his office and reprimanded her for speaking to the CEO in public. These are good examples of hubristic behaviour, I think. A feeling that the individual concerned is superior to, different from anybody else, is entitled to special treatment of some kind or another, and shouldn't really be bothered with the everyday details of life that the rest of us have to pursue. Likewise, many of these individuals frequently engaged in relentless pursuit of acquisitions and mergers, in the process frequently decrying, denigrating and rejecting advice that they received that these acquisitions were in error. One interviewee told me about sitting down, a colleague of his who sat down with the CEO and said, look, members of the team studying this acquisition just don't think that it makes sense. We should not pursue it. The CEO paused for a moment, thought for a few seconds, and then said, right, you're fired. I want you out of the building by the end of today, and if you ever tell anybody about this, then I'm going to sue you to hell and back for the rest of your career. An example of that ludicrous overconfidence that one individual possesses all the wisdom that they have to make these kinds of big decisions. And of course, no one individual is like that. No one individual knows everything. In fact, you think about it, most of us barely know what's going on in our own families, let alone what's going on in big organisations to make those decisions. Where are your children right now, for example? What are they doing? Do you trust them? But what is it like to try and manage in minute detail an entire organisation of that kind? Frequently, my interviewees described to me the culture of not just recklessness, but of the denigration of any critical feedback that they received. An atmosphere, for example, of barely disguised contempt for regulators who were viewed as not very impressive individuals and people who were seen as not really having the resources, the expertise or the insight to guide what these wiser people in the banks should do. And one individual that I interviewed, who actually was a former banking CEO, talked about being in a major dinner in Germany with Gerhard Schroeder, who at that time had become Chancellor of Germany. And this CEO was there with a number of bankers from the UK. He told me that they basically spent the dinner insulting Schroeder, saying to him, "Why did you make these decisions on this, that and the other? Are you stupid or what?" As he said, they had more or less forgotten who they were talking to, and it became a grotesque kind of spectacle. This little baseball bat is to illustrate another incident that, of abusive behaviour. And a lot of people talk to me about this, about a culture of abuse, of foul language and macho bluster on the part of people within various banks. In this instance, this individual was the head of human resources at a major bank. He went to see another senior manager with, I think it was the head of marketing. And this individual, the head of marketing, was trying to explain to the person concerned that something he wanted to do could not be done. Now, the individual had a reputation for always beginning in a charming way, and he did so on this occasion. "Don't worry, we'll work something out. This can be sorted out." The guy kept saying, no, this is not going to work. Then the behaviour escalated to foul-mouthed abuse. "You effing stupid little C, it will be done my way," and so on. The guy still kept saying, "No, it can't be done." And the man concerned had 2 baseball bats in his office. So he then picked up a baseball bat and began to wield it in a threatening manner. "This will be done my way." It turned out, however, that this head of marketing had been an amateur boxer in the past, and he simply stopped the guy and said, "If you lay a finger on me, I will put you in hospital." Whereupon he immediately started saying, "Oh, it was just a joke, don't worry, I didn't mean any of it." Now, what is very interesting in this particular case is that my interviewee and the head of marketing then went to see the then bank's CEO to complain about his behaviour, and they both assumed that he would be let go. It turned out he wasn't let go at all. In fact, he went on to become bank CEO himself within a couple of years. In his particular case, it all led to nemesis, because other bad behaviour that he then engaged in did lead to his resignation under adverse circumstances. And if you knew his name, you would know, you might get an idea of this, but of course I can't share that for reasons of confidentiality. So many other examples arise from this. Another interviewee told me about his CEO, who was a great fan of Starbucks coffee, but didn't want to go out to get any, for example. So he had a little Starbucks area built in the corner of his office. He didn't like people going out for it either, but he had it built in the corner of his office. And he had someone who then went and brought the coffee to him, but he had to have the coffee facing him in a certain way so that he could see the logo when he was drinking his cup of coffee. So it's behaviour born of different things that really, in classical terms, leads to the willful abuse of other people, abuse of power, gathering more and more of the resources of the organisation for oneself, and so on. And I think that we can understand this a little bit by what I might describe here as inflection points. Those 2 individuals at the bottom, by the way, are the leaders of Enron. The one on the left is the fellow in jail. The one on the right, Kenneth Lay, is the individual who deceased. I think we have a number of behaviours that characterise hubris, but I also think that there's a number of dynamics that many organisations unleash, which then reinforces them. Some people, of course, are innately predisposed to this. It can be a personality trait. I view hubris as a manifestation, a behavioural manifestation of narcissism. But in the banking and finance sector, people all describe to me, and we all know that this is the case, enormous institutional pressure for success. Huge rewards, by the way, if you achieve that success, but success defined pretty much in narrow financial terms. If we carry out this merger, this acquisition, or do X, we will all get terribly rich. I think, for example, when not ABN AMRO, but when the Royal Bank of Scotland acquired the NatWest Bank back in the 90s, the people involved got bonuses close to £1 million for successfully carrying this through. So you can see the incentive there to go in that particular direction. High levels of reward, which is associated with the acquisition of power. And as I said at the very beginning, acquiring power tends not to bring out the best in most of us. It was Lord Acton who famously said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He might have argued in the banking and finance sector that absolute power is even nicer than having power, such is the way in which people covet it and want it. We then, of course, have all these perks of office that people become attached to. The ability to have a Starbucks built in your office, for example, being just one. Another interviewee told me about the chairman of a bank that he sometimes had to go and see. And apparently you would arrive at the headquarters of the bank in order to see the chairman. When people knew that that was who you were meeting, you were ushered off to a little private lift at the side, which was curtained off. And then you went up to his floor, where if you were having lunch with him, some butler would arrive and serve a private lunch for both of you. He told me that on one occasion he said to the individual concerned, well, let's go for a walk. And instead the guy said, no, let me get the car to take you back to your work. And the car, of course, was a chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce, which even in the British military I don't think is common behaviour on the part of leaders. It certainly isn't in the academic environment that I am part of. So these are some of the processes which don't exist only in banking and finance, which drive what we are talking about. At least to this kind of scenario, do you recognise the at the centre? Kim Jong-il, is that it, how you pronounce it? Who, any picture you see of him, he is always surrounded by individuals taking notes. A habit that began with his grandfather, who in the view of the time knows everything about everything. So whatever piece of trivia they are saying must be written down by the individuals around them. Imagine what that does to the ego, by the way, of the individuals concerned, being surrounded and pampered in that particular way. The consequences in organisations include the following: the elimination of an enormous suspicion on the part of leaders of dissent. This is precisely the opposite of what we need. I was very struck by Jack Straw's comments on this morning, where he talked about the need to openly ventilate and express different opinions, especially when huge decisions like the war in Iraq are being contemplated. And yet somehow in many organisational contexts, a culture has grown up where the opposite is the case, whereby individuals are suspicious of dissent, where they disregard it, and they do not encourage it sufficiently. We could talk about this all day, but I think that that's one of the most fundamental mistakes of leadership that is made in most of our organisations, combined with the view that we exaggerate what leaders can accomplish. They are appointed with huge fanfare, they are given golden handcuffs, they almost inevitably develop an inflated view of what they can deliver, and we encourage that. I printed out this from Harvard Business Review just yesterday, the current issue of it, an article by the CEO, the former CEO of General Electric, entitled "How I Remade General Electric." I'm instantly suspicious of any leader who says, I remade an entire organisation. There are tens of thousands of people in this company. Surely they had something to do with remaking it. Surely every decision didn't come from the CEO, from Jeff Immelt, but that is not the model of leadership that we are encouraged to adopt. Sadly, in most organisations, they operate suggestion schemes that resemble this. We need something slightly different. And to say what that difference is, I will simply and briefly point out a major source of error that we all face. And Winston Churchill summed it up very well in 1931 when he was writing about a major military disaster in the First World War. I think this is a lovely quote. You can almost hear the Churchillian tones to it, where the temptation to tell a chief in a great position what he most likes to hear is one of the commonest explanations of mistaken policy. Academics have a grander name for it, inevitably, ingratiation theory, colloquially known as sucking up to the boss. The finding that when we have a difference of power between two people, the individual who has less power usually exaggerates how much they agree with the leader to acquire influence over them. Does that sound like a familiar dynamic? Or as that great philosopher Homer Simpson once put it, when he was giving Bart some career advice, he said, Bart, always remember to say, good idea, boss. Good idea, boss. And most of us are experts at this. The evidence is that when we are flattered in this way, we suck it up. We enjoy it. We believe that it is true. We are inclined to become like a rock star surrounded by a sycophantic entourage. And on the other hand, when we receive criticism, we instinctively reject it. It feels inappropriate and wrong to us. It is called the automatic vigilance effect. Any criticism feels slightly wrong to us. Why did you wear that colour of cardigan that you're wearing today, for example? And yeah, that one. And that style of glasses, do you really think that it suits you to your best? And so we don't like criticism of that kind. I know that today when I'm away, my wife is visiting the hairdresser. I know when I go home that she will ask me a question. What do you think of my hair? And you know what my answer will be as well. We learn these dynamics very well. Unfortunately, in business organizations, when we have flattery, CEOs develop even more favorable views of their expertise than is warranted, and hubris begins to develop. All of which begs the question, what can we do about it? Well, I think that we need to rethink our view of leadership. We need to avoid looking upon leaders as corporate saviours. We need to avoid thinking that we should concentrate rewards and all powers of decision making in the hands of one or two people. I think we also need to stop expecting leaders to make a difference instantly. There are books out there with titles such as The First 90 Days. In the first 90 days you must radically do something. I disagree. I think in the first 90 days you're still struggling to find your way to the bathroom in most cases. You're still learning, or you should be learning, before you make drastic decisions. I think we need leaders who scrutinise positive feedback much more intensely than they do negative feedback. At the moment it's the other way around. But I think when we get positive feedback, we should stop. I think we need to develop systems among our leading teams where we institutionalise dissent into the decision-making process. We need to appoint formal devil's advocates when big decisions are being made. We need to ask people to express doubts. We need to role model that by expressing doubts ourselves. Ultimately, leadership is 90% example, and unless we and people in authority role model that, other people will not take it seriously. We need to lead with questions and not answers. We don't have to pretend to have all the answers when we're in positions of authority. We need to use that magic phrase, I do not know. There are many historical examples that show the value of that kind of approach. I think we have drifted away from it. We need to go back to it. We need to embrace loud debate, heated discussions, and healthy conflict much more than we do. Uniformity and conformity is the enemy of rational decision making, even though it is appealing to us when we are in positions of authority. There is only one organisational context that I know of where everybody is in agreement with everybody else all the time, and that on all important issues, and that is a graveyard. Beyond that, we all have heated opinions about everything. I think the job of leadership is to bring that much more to the fore, and in doing so, to strike a blow against dysfunctional leadership in general and hubristic leadership in particular. Thank you.